Let's jump right in. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a truly groundbreaking paper on a concept called Dissipative Tensor Rotation Networks, or DTRN for short. We're going to explore how a radical reimagining of classical neural network architecture might actually solve some of the absolute most stubborn bottlenecks in both machine learning and quantum chemistry. So picture this, simulating highly complex quantum chemistry right on your standard everyday laptop. Sounds a bit like sci-fi, right? I mean, we've been told for decades that simulating strongly correlated quantum systems absolutely requires a massive, fault-tolerant quantum computer, a machine that, frankly, doesn't even exist yet at a useful scale. But what if we've just been looking at the problem entirely the wrong way? What if we could pull off a massive computational heist and run these simulations on the hardware sitting on your desk right now? Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap. 1. The twin computing bottlenecks. 2. Stealing from quantum mechanics. 3. The math of DTRN. 4. The dissipative bottleneck. 5. Vision tasks with PG-ADRN. And 6. Quantum chemistry on laptops. Section 1. The twin computing bottlenecks. We're essentially facing dual computing barriers right now. On one side, we have machine learning. Think about a single 7 billion parameter language model. It imposes just an enormous matrix multiply budget per forward pass. The main villain here? Dense, completely unstructured weight matrices. On the other side, we've got strongly correlated quantum chemistry, things like transition metal dimers. In this realm, the wave function lives in a Hilbert space that grows exponentially with the number of active electrons, defying classical attack. But here's the really foundational insight of this paper. Both of these problems are actually instances of the exact same structural issue. They are both fundamentally dominated by the extreme cost of large, unstructured linear maps. Section 2. Stealing from quantum mechanics. Now, the canonical answer to that exponential wave function growth has pretty much always been, we need a fault-tolerant quantum computer. But the author of this paper asked a brilliant question. Are the efficiency gains we attribute to quantum computation actually properties of quantum hardware, or are they just properties of the mathematical structures that quantum mechanics happens to generate? By looking at an older concept called the dissipative quantum neural network, the author essentially extracted 3 purely classical mathematical ingredients. First, tensor product factorization, so breaking a massive weight down into a product of small local factors. Second, unitarity and orthogonally, ensuring each factor preserves its norm. And third, partial trace dissipation, which means selectively discarding and refreshing information. The DTRN algorithm successfully takes these 3 quantum properties and just ports them directly onto standard commodity classical hardware. And this brilliantly illustrates how it actually looks. Instead of one giant, heavy, dense matrix, the weight operator is built out as a Kronecker product of smaller rotation matrices. These feed into cross-factor mixers to introduce carefully controlled correlations and then finally pass through a dissipative bottleneck. This entire setup completely bypasses the need for massive, unstructured, dense layers.
Section 3. The math of DTRN.
Okay, we need to talk about the math here, specifically the Kronecker product of Givens rotation matrices in the special orthogonal group, or SO of D. When I first dug into this, it definitely seemed a bit dense, but think of these SO of D matrices like perfectly synchronized interlocking gears, because every single rotation matrix is parameterized via the matrix exponential of a skew-symmetric generator. They are mathematically guaranteed to maintain exact orthogonality at every single gradient step. Meaning, the network doesn't need constant normalization or tricky corrections to prevent the math from blowing up or decaying to zero. The gears just turn, and they maintain perfect balance automatically. And because of that interlocking gear structure, we hit this explosive single number, big O of log n. This right here is the insane parameter scaling advantage of DTRN. For a network layer with an effective width of n, a standard dense network needs parameters that scale quadratically. It gets huge fast. DTRN? It requires only logarithmic parameters. We are literally replacing a massive quadratic explosion of data with a nice, slow-growing logarithmic curve. So the crucial point is that this exact mathematical alignment doesn't just save memory space, it yields an incredibly fast forward pass. Applying this massive mathematical structure to a vector just naturally decomposes into sequential factor applications. The computational cost scales at big O of n log n. Now, for anyone familiar with signal processing, you'll know that is the exact same blazing fast asymptotic complexity as a fast Fourier transform.
Section 4. The dissipative bottleneck.
But here we run into an absolutely essential mathematical question. If you just stack a bunch of orthogonal linear maps together, they mathematically just collapse right back into one single linear map. Depth provides basically no benefit. The network wouldn't be able to learn any complex nonlinear functions. So what's the trick? Where is the nonlinearity?
The answer lies in what's called the dissipative bottleneck. Between layers, a learned fraction of the tensor factors is simply discarded, thrown out, and replaced with fresh, trainable factors. Think of it kind of like a club bouncer. The bouncer lets some of the old tired factors out of the club and lets fresh, new ones in. This plays a dual role. First, it breaks the linearity. This is the network's critical nonlinearity, the thing that actually allows it to learn deep, complex functions. Second, and this is almost miraculous, this club bouncer naturally enforces an exact area law entanglement bound. The tensor factor bipartition creates an entanglement cap, which means the mathematical correlations between different parts of the system are strictly bounded. They cannot spiral out of control. It perfectly mimics the entanglement structure of gapped ground states in quantum physics.
Section 5. Vision tasks with PEGA-DTRN. Now, what's really interesting is seeing what happens when this is aligned with the native structure of a real problem. Standard DTRN flattens an image, which loses all spatial locality, but this geometry-aware version, called PEGDETRN, represents an image as a patch lattice, properly encoding those horizontal and vertical correlations. When tested on the MNSD dataset, PEGDTRN effortlessly beats the standard dense multi-layer perceptron baseline, and it does it while using 32% fewer parameters. But how do we know for sure it's the geometry doing the heavy lifting, and not just the baseline DTRN structure? Well, the researchers ran a controlled ablation study. They removed that geometry-aware mixing component, basically reverting it back to a flat DTRN. The result? Accuracy plummeted from over 99% down to about 87%. That is a decisive 12.64 percentage point gap. It definitively proves that aligning the tensor factorization with the geometric inductive bias, meaning the native structure of the problem, is what drives the incredible accuracy here. It's not just sheer width. Let's move to a harder data set like CFAR10 and see how this builds. Here we see a very stable multi-seed compression, while the dense network completely fails on CFAR10, just languishing down at around 40% accuracy. PGAD-TRN marches right up the curve. It closes in to within 1.3 percentage points of the convolutional neural network baseline. And again, it does this while actually using 5% fewer parameters. It just proves that the architecture's representational capacity is incredibly robust when you properly align the geometry. Section 6. Quantum Chemistry on Laptops. Okay, we've reached the finale, and the paper states something truly, truly incredible here. All quantum chemistry runs were completed on an Apple M1 laptop class machine. No quantum hardware, no HPC cluster. Let that sink in. We are talking about taking exponential, strongly correlated molecular systems, the exact kind of problems the entire industry assumed required a fault-tolerant quantum computer or a massive supercomputing cluster. And they are running them on a standard off-the-shelf laptop. The stark juxtaposition here is just mind-blowing. To truly appreciate this, let's look at the raw data. The researchers targeted strongly interacting electrons in transition metal dimers, specifically chromium-2 and iron-2. The gold standard benchmark for success in this field is chemical accuracy, which is defined as a variational gap of less than 1 millihartree compared to an exact reference. Look at chromium-2 in a CAS-8 active space, a 0.271 millihartree gap. Sub-millihartree accuracy. Now look at the incredibly complex chromium-2 in a CAS-12 active space, 0.494 millihartree. Chemical accuracy achieved. And for iron-2, finding the exact native spin-zero ground state, a 0.266 millihartree gap. Absolute sub-millihartree accuracy across the board. And just to really cement the sheer magnitude of this achievement, for that incredibly complex chromium-2 CAS-1212 active space, the solver, which they call a chemistry-aware DTRN that perfectly respects orbital and spin geometry, it simulated over 102,000 determinants, and it crossed that sub-millihartree chemical accuracy threshold in exactly 19.5 minutes. Again, on a single M1 laptop. No quantum hardware, no trauterization, just pure, classical, domain-aligned tensor factorization. And that leaves us with this final, truly provocative thought. DTRN essentially proves that the seemingly insurmountable bottlenecks we face in AI and quantum chemistry aren't necessarily absolute hardware limits. They might just be structural alignment problems. Think about it. If mathematically aligning a classical algorithm with a problem's native geometric or orbital structure can perfectly replicate the entanglement benefits of quantum mechanics and literally replace a supercomputer with a standard laptop, what impossible computing barrier are we going to break down next? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep learning.